folks. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to this increased Brownbag. My name is Bart Wuthrich. I'm welcoming you on behalf of the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies. We have a couple of other things, events that are coming later in the week that I'll talk about just in preparation before I introduce our speaker for today. Tomorrow we're actually doing something with respect to the Council of Foreign Relations where we're hosting an academic conference call. This is something where they reach out to people in universities across the nation, and so we're going to be listening as we have a young lady who shares her experience in terms of working in foreign policy. That's going to be from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. here in Bailey 318. We anticipate it's going to be mostly students, but anyone really is welcome to join. And then on Friday, we're going to be hosting Friday Night at the Kino. This is a recent piece that's come out called Daleko at Sunset Boulevard, Far from Sunset Boulevard, from 7 to 9. And right here, we're having a little bit of technical difficulty with our overhead projector. If we get that figured out, we'll have it in here. If not, it'll probably be down the hall in 301. And then I'll remind you that next Monday, December 7th, we're going to be hosting the Pali lecture with Sofia Andrukovich, who is a Ukrainian author and translator. She's going to be coming in and speaking in the Kansas Union Jayhawk Room next week. So we invite you to come and listen to that. Our speaker today is Michael Wuthrich. He is the Director of Global and International Studies and is an expert on Turkish elections, and he's recently published a book called National Elections in Turkey, People, Politics, and the Party System. So he's been making the rounds, doing a lot of these talks about his book, but also I'm sure talking about the outcome of the recent election. So very happy that he agreed to come in and indulge us with another one of these. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Bart. And I think the plan for today, I've actually done a lot of talks on the book that just came out, but I think the more interesting part that most people come to hear about is what the heck just went on in November, in the November 1st election, and it is kind of an intriguing election. So I'm actually going to spend on my book, which actually covers campaigns and elections in Turkey from 1950 to the 2011 election. I'm going to spend a lot more time talking about this more recent election and what I think are the very key takeaways from it. And it was a bit of it's actually exactly 1 month ago today, the election. I remember sitting at home watching the election results come in, and my first instinct when I saw the votes coming in, I literally thought, this is fraud. Like they finally have done it. They finally found a way to tinker with the elections to get the result that they wanted to. But then as the results kept coming in and looking at the total election environment, I realized it wasn't fraud at all. It was just a completely unanticipated, unexpected electoral result. I mean, I think there's always minor issues of fraud. I think in most elections and localities, even in our own, there are those potential issues of finagling or whatnot. But the election was heavily monitored by opposition groups and everything else, and there was very little to complain about. So then the question is, why did it happen? Why did the governing party gain 9% of the vote? And the interesting part about that, and I think I have an explanation for all of this, but the interesting part about that is I truly believe there's good evidence to argue that the AKP themselves did not expect that they were going to do as well as they did. There was a lot of evidence by key elites that they were already conceding before the election that it was going to be a similar result to the previous result in June, and they wouldn't have had a good reason to do that if they thought otherwise. And even the Turkey does a lot of election polling, and this was part of the reason why people were so surprised. The really reliable polling sources that do, the pre-election polls had the Justice and Development Party numbers at around, 42, maybe 44 at the outside, 44%, and the The Justice and Development Party kind of has their own survey polling group that always inflates their numbers a great deal. And that polling group gave them a 47%, right? And they ended up walking away with more than 49% of the vote. And so, and to some extent, nobody saw it coming. And I think there's a reason for why that was. And I want to talk about that. The biggest surprise, and we'll talk about this, was how the Kurdish population in the Kurdish provinces voted. I think that was the one wild card factor that I think nobody really anticipated. And we'll discuss that in my book. My book actually makes a longer-term, nuanced argument that rather than some of the general postulates that Turkish elections have always been the same old thing since 1950, that there's actually been very clear patterns of orientations of how people approached the elections over time, that there were patterns where people fell into certain assumptions, both political parties and also the voters themselves kind of saw this is the way politics and elections go, and parties that kind of gave themselves into that mentality tended to do better while others suffered, and then something else would enter the system, be it from socioeconomic changes, information technology changes, or just some innovation by strategic political actors changed kind of the rules of the game in terms of how you would campaign and compete for votes. So from 1950 to about 2007, I argued that there were 4 fairly distinct periods where you could see the periods being marked out also by election returns from province to province. But then at 2007, and of course I was doing a lot of the research and writing it shortly before and after the 2011 election, there appeared to be signs that different forces are acting upon the system and the outcomes and assumptions about campaigning. And so my argument in the book, just to give you an idea of what I think we're mostly looking at in the current period, is that there's a predominant party paradigm, and predominant parties over time in democracies tend to be somewhat problematic for democracy in most places. But in Turkey, some of the exacerbating factors in that regard are related to the existing corporate media structure in Turkey. Especially since the 1980s, media has been a game for big business barons who have most of their money is in construction or other sorts of things, and then they also buy a couple mass media, television, newspaper outlets or whatever. So in this kind of environment, of course, people have been complaining for a while that this was potentially a problem. Of course, if you have somebody who's got a lot of his eggs in a different kind of basket, and you're say taking bids from the government, you're less likely to be really critical of the government, during a big bid or whatever. You're going to be very careful. You're going to pull your punches. You're going to self-censor, and some of that has probably been going on, since the 80s and the Ozal period, but it wasn't ever the problem itself wasn't as completely as, disastrous as perhaps the direction it's heading into now. And that's because in both positive and negative ways, the Turkish politics of the 1980s and 90s was kind of ruled by constantly changing governments. The political parties were changing. There was a lot of rivalry and fragmentation. Therefore, these big, corporate barons couldn't put all their eggs in basket in that regard. They couldn't totally sell out to one political party or whatnot. During a more of a, since the Justice and Development Party has established its dominance, it's been able to influence this media structure far more than any party before it has, and that's for several reasons. When you're sitting, one of the ways that they've been able to influence it over time, simply by being in power so long, is that when a large media corporation or when a large corporation has to sell off its media holdings, the oversight on the bids are run by the oversight is run by the government. The government makes a determination who gets the media outlet, and so they've been, over their tenure in government, they've been kind of turning those mainstream newspapers over to friends and supporters and literally relatives. So that's been a problem, and this is particularly a serious problem because, in one sense, if you know anything about the Turkish kind of news spectrum, there's a lot of ideology in Turkish news, and of course you can still find that today. You can pull up the newspapers, right now that have Erdogan with fangs and everything else, and they're largely going untouched by the government. Partly because the government's not concerned about those newspapers, because those newspapers are preaching to the choir. The only people reading the strong opposition newspapers are people who are already in the opposition. What they have been doing quite successfully is gaining more and more influence over the mainstream papers that are supposed to be kind of neutral or floating out there in the middle, and turning those toward their perspective, right? And when that has failed, they have resorted to other tactics of, accusing editors and owners of fraud or other kinds of things, not always directly related to criticizing them, but say, oh, you're treasonous, or you had some sort of plot or whatnot. And of course, maybe in the news recently, if you've been following Turkey at all, if you've been hearing issues of censor and control of the media in Turkey, you've been hearing it in relationship to the government and the Fetullah Gulen organization. He also owns a lot of media, and they were, for the initial period of the Justice and Development Party's tenure, they were, bedfellows basically. In the last 4 years or so, they've split quite dramatically. And so since Fetullah Gulen actually owns the newspaper with the widest circulation in Turkey, that's become a big problem, which obviously is ranting every day against the government and whatnot. That's been something that the Justice and Development Party and Erdogan have begun to attack fairly vigorously in one way or another. The other thing that has happened since 2007, which was a big change from the period from, say, 1995 to 2007, is in that earlier period, what you had was a situation where parties on the right realized, because of some major organizational and governing problems of parties that were in the center, especially center right and center left, that if they moderated their rhetoric, took on a lot of pragmatic policy, they could move themselves into fill up the position of those previous parties and kind of steal their electoral base. And so what happened then, if you actually look at the campaigning during that period, you had kind of this bizarre situation where these parties on the right trying to move into the center sound like really normal, practical parties that who wouldn't vote for them, look at all these good ideas or whatever. They don't seem so bad. They're, talking in very normal ways. And then you had the parties in the center and the left taking very much a cultural war, us versus them, end of the world, dark, light, very extreme kind of cultural battle, culture kampf kind of battle as a framing for their campaigns. Well, this has noticeably changed since 2007, where the Justice and Development Party, which would have been that party from the right moving to the center that really framed itself as an inclusivist, liberal party for everyone, started to tried to shore up its conservative and nationalist and, more devout, religious conservative base, and bring in, although they didn't change this offering pragmatic policy in their discourse, they started talking about religion. They, believe it or not, the Justice and Development Party almost didn't use religion at all in their campaigns in 2002 and 2007, but they started flavoring all of their explanations of it. They were still talking about pragmatic policy, but they were framing it into, what Salah ad-Din did, during the Crusades and this and that, and trying to relate to their audience through religion and nationalism. And that was a big change, and that's something that continued, that's continued since 2007. So anyway, just to give you a picture of what's happened more recently, Turkey has more or less collapsed into a four relevant party system with fairly clear ideological differences between those four parties, which is, if you knew Turkish politics at all before this period of time, that would be a big surprise. The Turkish party system has been, filled with a lot of redundancy in terms of parties. Basically, guys that grew up in the same ideological spectrum, that both wanted to be the leader, they would split and then campaign for the same electorate against each other. You don't have that kind of a situation anymore. So you have a more or less center-right coalition, really, of various factions under the Justice and Development Party, led by, obviously, Erdogan, the most famous member of that group, being the president now, technically not supposed to have direct affiliation with the party, and then the prime minister is Ahmet Davutoglu. And then this would be the descendant of Ataturk's party, which they kind of frame themselves on the center left. They're led by Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu. And then you have these two smaller, more minority nationalist parties. One that's a Turkish nationalist right party. And then you have a Kurdish nationalist left party. And they basically, like, if you go from 2002, the nationalist parties didn't even enter into parliament at that point because they didn't have the necessary 10% threshold. But since that point, the system has more or less gravitated around these four parties that get more than 95% of the vote at this point. And starting in 2007, the Kurdish Nationalist Left Party actually got around the 10% national threshold loophole by running all of their candidates as independents. And so they were able to enter parliament as independents and then form the party once they got into parliament. They did that in 2007. They did it again in 2011. And then they went for broke in June and said, we're going all or nothing. We're going to try to pass the 10% threshold as a party. They were able to do it, and then although they lost, there was a notable loss in their support in November. They managed to stay above the threshold, and still, if you note, because of the way that their voters are clustered, they actually get more seats in parliament than the Turkish Nationalist Rightist Party, despite the fact that they had a higher percentage of the overall vote. So this is kind of the picture that we're seeing now, and the question obviously is, what happened here within a short period of time in an early election? How do we explain this outside of fraud or cheating or tampering or whatever? How do we explain that rise in votes? And I think I can mostly explain it from four big takeaways that I think a lot of people are, if you're familiar with Turkey at all, these are all things that you've heard people discuss, and I think we learned some significant points about all four of these things from the November 1st election, or if not before. And so I'd like to kind of mostly focus on this. First with the Kurds, One of the important takeaways is, and I think this is why a lot of people were caught off guard by the electoral result, is that after June 7th, I think a lot of people, both within Turkey and outside of Turkey, were lulled into kind of an identity assumptions. Okay, the Kurds are now voting for this Kurdish party. Of course, they're always going to, especially in an environment where there's a polarization between the PKK terrorist group and the governing party. So it seemed like, well, in such a polarized environment, they would have a lot of incentive to stay with the Kurdish party. Well, Kurdish voters have never been that predictable, and that's one of the things that you could actually go through the elections in Turkey throughout time and see that they've been all over the map in terms of who they voted for, whether it was a Kurdish politician or a Turkish politician or not. They've actually switched their vote a decent amount, and actually, if you look at if you just compare, and we could go back further, but like I thought it was interesting just to look. These are the provinces in the southeast that have like like 80% or more of the population is of Kurdish origin. If you go just from 2011, actually, I didn't want to go crazy with columns, but actually, if you went to 2007, you would see that this is the votes for the Justice and Development Party in those provinces. If you go back to June 2007, these totals are almost across the board higher, even higher for the Justice and Development Party. So June 2011, but then you see in June 15 a massive change, drop in votes, and then November you see more or less a return. There's a few cases where they actually voted. There were only 2 provinces that voted above their 2011 total for the Justice and Development Party, but you see kind of where those votes were coming from. There were voters for the Justice and Development Party among Kurds, and this is actually, again, more reduced than 2007. Why would they just switch back and forth like that? Well, one of the things that's not covered in the media very much is that in the whole pan-Kurdish diaspora, there's important ideological cleavages among Kurds that explain a lot of the confusing behaviors that we're talking about Syria or Iraq or Turkey, especially Iranian Kurds have been mostly keeping to themselves over the last few years, but the same would apply to them too. That there's a massive cleavage within Kurdish society based on how Kurdish nationalism developed. It's a fairly late developing nationalism. People who weren't Kurds recognized Kurds far more quickly than Kurds recognized themselves as such, particularly as Kurdish rather than as smaller group identities within that population. But as Kurdish nationalism proper developed among these societies, it actually developed through the language of the left, right? Marxist or socialist ideology created a vision that gave them words to speak about their environment and their societies that was useful, especially for young people and for rank and file members of Kurdish communities to kind of buy into in terms of egalitarian, but also this challenge of traditional Kurdish socio-political hierarchical structures, which actually prevented Kurds from kind of looking horizontally toward each other, right? The Kurdish structures have been very hierarchical, and that did a lot to prevent a grassroots development of nationalism. Well, the left opened that up, and it did that effectively to some extent, with one obvious major drawback. Well, to the extent that it worked, it was also embedded within this leftist ideology, and of course, you're never going to get 100% of the members of the society to say, buy into a leftist socialist ideology, right? You're always going to have conservatives within a society, and those conservatives would easily see it not as an identity issue, but an ideology issue. And across the four major countries, the countries where there's Kurds, there's only one place where a conservative nationalist Kurdish ideology has really developed in any semblance that we could speak of, and that's in Iraq. So if you've heard of Barzani and the kind of the leader of the KRG right now, the Barzani family, the Barzanis basically built their understanding of Kurdish nationalism off of a traditional conservative understanding of Kurdishness and Kurdish society. But even in Iraq, there's a strong leftist pole that has been fighting against them, since the 1960s. But in Iran and Syria and Turkey, the leftist understanding of nationalism was pretty much the only one that took root. But because of that, Kurds who see themselves as conservative have tended to be hands-off. And they've also, in Turkey, they've tended to vote for religious conservative parties, or usually Turkish parties, in elections. So you had a lot of conservative Kurds in the southeast who were obviously Kurds, but voting for the Justice and Development Party, that for whatever reason decided to make identity an issue on June 15th. But then, of course, as things polarized, part of what happened could be explained in the sense that they realized, as they saw the behavior of the party after it won, I think some of them said, well, I don't know if I want to be associated with that sort of thinking or whatnot. They might have been all supportive of a process to increase cultural rights for Kurds or whatnot, but they didn't buy it. They certainly, these voters too are mostly certainly tend to be antagonistic to the PKK. So they're not against Kurdish nationalism per se, but PKK is too far, maybe, that's something that has tended to be untouchable by some Kurds. And to the extent that there was an argument that the Kurdish nationalist leftist party kind of muddled its identity with the PKK in this period in between, and that was part of the reason why they lost votes there against the particularly Kurdish or conservative Kurdish votes. The other issue is simply the instability issue. So in the southeast especially, a lot of Kurds would have to see what was going on as a potential danger the PKK and the war with the state destroyed the local economy, development, progress, and during the period of peace, that area has actually been developing fairly rapidly, and there's been a lot of positive economic development and growth. People are, raising their social economic status, and so another embroiled conflict with the Turkish state is not something that some of these, at least many within the Kurdish community, might not want to kind of look forward to, and so some of them arguably made a stability vote in that case. So, and it's hard to know exactly where they're going to go in the future. It doesn't mean just because they switch back to, I think they have, again, if you look at the history of Kurdish voters, they've gone very pragmatically, like which option is the best option for us today, right? There's not this long-term loyalty to any one party or group, whether it's Kurdish or not. And that was an important wild card. This is another reason, this instability and the instability between June and November was the biggest reason, I would argue, that the surveys were incorrect. And the reason was the polling companies admitted after the election results came out that the southeast provinces were too dangerous for their pollster. They didn't want to go there and actually do the poll. And so they were making estimates or like polling in random ways from those provinces, which was inflating the vote for the Kurdish nationalist leftist party. And that's probably one of the big reasons why it was skewed. The rest of the numbers, especially for the other opposition parties, tended to be actually fairly accurate. They tended to be off on the Kurdish Nationalist Party. The other big takeaway from the election, sorry that's small, but I think arguably convincingly after these last series of elections, we know a lot more about the Fetullah Gulen movement than we did previously, and I'll explain what I mean by that. So if you've heard of Fetullah Gulen, this is a picture of Fetullah Gulen. He's actually been living in America, in the U.S. since the late 90s. So he lives in Pennsylvania, and he's a interesting fellow, kind of a cleric. He's known as a cleric to his supporters, but he's really kind of a businessman too, has lots of money, and he has a particular vision of Islam that's been built off of a previous kind of enlightened Kurdish, actually, cleric in Turkey, from the early period of the 20th century, Said Nursi. He built his interpretation off of Said Nursi, which was more of a modern, enlightened interpretation of Sunni Islam, but one that was extremely devout nonetheless, and very missional. So, this is Fetullah Gulen. Well, scholars have generally, and if you've read stuff about Fetullah Gulen, especially prior to 2013, you're going to read all kinds of conspiracies and possibilities about how strong they are, like the fact that all he has to do is step his foot and, like fly back and put his foot onto Istanbul, and all of Turkey would kind of rise up, and he would be the new premier or whatever. And they've argued that, this is a crack squadron of people who respond to his every demand and whatnot. That's not absolutely untrue, but the question is, how many of them are there? And so in this current environment, basically the government has 100% gone after this group, the supporters and Fetullah Gulen, his holdings. They've really tried to cripple him economically, especially within Turkey, and threatened to throw everybody that supports him in jail, practically, and has certainly targeted his media outlets and whatnot. Nonetheless, no change. I mean, if you look at the voting distribution since that time, there's no fluke now. This has to be actually in terms of the number of people that are supported and tied into this group, that number is electorally insignificant, fairly insignificant. They had been voting en masse for the Justice and Development Party. We know that. Well, where have their votes gone? Right? The change in votes at best could be 2 or 3%, maybe. That's being generous in terms of their actual vote. The voting base power of the Fetullah Gulen movement can only be that large, right? There's no other explanation than that. But what that doesn't mean, right, that it's not a highly coordinated network with supporters in strategic places, particularly in the police force. I think part of the conspiracy theory that Erdogan is talking about, I think, is true. I mean, I feel pretty confident that he knew correctly that there were quite a few Gulen supporters in the police, that was an area where the good old boy network had brought in a bunch of the supporters into the police force. And that also explains the strange period of, there was a period post-2000, from 2010 to 2014, when there was any sort of election at stake. There were these weird clandestine kind of video leaks that were kind of scandals for politicians. I really think that those were leaked by Gulen supporters within the police. And they initially worked in favor of the Justice and Development Party, and then when they split, they turned that against them and leaking the tapes of Erdogan talking to his son about hiding money and all of that stuff. I do think Gulen was it's very, very, very likely that that was the case. Right? There's pretty good evidence for that. Whether or not people were rooting for them to expose that fraud or whatever, and whether it was completely legal for members of the police force to do that clandestinely or not is another issue. We also know that they, of course, yes, they still have lots of money in international schools and organizations that strongly, if indirectly, spread the gospel of Turkey. They have these schools all over Africa where they kind of teach children to speak Turkish, like perfectly, and then they enter them in global competitions and whatever. So you have in all these countries in like sub-Saharan Africa, you have these Turkish speakers going to very high quality educational institutions that are run by him. And then, of course, when school's out, they can use the facilities to say, hey, we're having this, Fetullah Gulen reading club or whatever if you want to join, or we're going to read the Quran today if anybody wants to join or not. So they kind of use them as a missional base. They still have one of the most widely circulated newspapers in Turkey, if not it's right up there, goes back and forth with some other mainstream papers, but we know that they don't have a large vote. The actual numbers of supporters, although they're very active, are actually not huge in number, and they can't be based on the elections. Because if you were hearing that, there's no way that they could, the only explanation is that they're hearing all these threats against their life and to be thrown into jail and everything else, and they still voted for that party. That, to me, that's a completely irrational assumption. The third takeaway, and that this is important, sometimes in the international media this gets confounded, but the critical issue really, like if we think about Erdogan's success, the Justice and Development Party's success, it is absolutely the issue really that's at stake is Erdogan's patrimonialism, or his desire for his own power and aggrandizement, not really Islamism or some sort of special Islamist turn. And I actually think that the focus on the latter has been a problem in knowing how to address and the issue of Erdogan as he's kind of spiraled out of control with power. And I'll try to explain what I mean by that. We have both empirical and plenty of anecdotal and fieldwork evidence that show that the supporters of the Justice and Development Party constantly see and argue that what they're voting for is a competent party that does stuff. They're not saying, well, there's this group, but we go for conservative values. That's never an argument ever given by anybody that supports the, like when they're talking about elections or whatever, people say it's crazy because you hear it every time, and it's like you're thinking it shouldn't be this obvious, or it shouldn't be this consistent. But no matter what province that they go to, the people will say, they built schools, they built hospitals, they built these beautiful parks. Our city looks better now, and Turks have a political tendency. If they have one, I would argue that if they have one political tendency is to look around, make determinations about what's good by what people have been doing for them lately and what they see immediately around them in terms of development. And the Justice and Development Party has realized, right, if you take care of cities, you're going to get the majority of those populations to vote for you because you have the money that you spend at the local level. If you plant a few trees, if you give people coal in the wintertime and free iftar, Ramadan, dinners, like during the month of Ramadan, and kind of say, all thanks to the Justice and Development Party, you're going to get a lot, especially urban poor, you're going to get a huge base of pragmatic votes in that regard. And so while people have kind of been spinning their wheels at like rhetoric and campaign speeches and whatnot, the Justice and Development Party has largely held its base by what it's done in the local municipalities, and of course they control most of them. right? So it gives them a huge advantage. So the places where the opposition parties are winning is also where the opposition parties are able to actually control those local governments and do similar things themselves, right? You sway the populace that way. And you can see also with the Justice and Development Party that happened. And after 2002, when they won the first time and they had a majority, in 2004, when there were local elections for municipalities, you can really see a huge difference in their voting increase in the provinces where they were able to newly take municipalities. Over the next several years, their vote increase in all of those cities drastically increased. And because people are often getting into like this cultural struggle in Turkey, they're missing the fact that the rank and file voter in Turkey, it might be voting for things that are more interesting to them than what we're talking about. Yeah, talked about that. So the other thing too, I'm not trying to say that Erdogan's not a religious conservative. He is. But this is another thing that's being missed. If you actually look at what he says and what he does by his policy, it's socially conservative. It's religious conservative. It's kind of median voter kind of policy that most people would actually support. I actually think if you looked at Erdogan's actual policies and you showed them to, he could run on a Republican ticket pretty easily, right? Like what his policy, his outlook is very, very similar to Republican candidates in the United States. And to argue that that's Islamism isn't going to sway the voters over, because that's still his views never dip below the median voter. I mean, he's got the view of the mainstream Turkey, okay, in terms of his outlook. He's not crazy Islam. He is devout, I think, but like his actual practices, his practices with his family, the way that he engages himself in public is kind of middle of the road, and certainly wouldn't account to devotion in many other, let's say, Gulf states or whatever. It's on a different level of conservatism, completely different level there. The final takeaway is that, I actually think the current the voting pattern is there's kind of a problematic impasse in terms of the current party structure in Turkey that I think is particularly concerning, and that is that certainly, if things stay the way that they are and the elections stay relatively free and fair, there's not a complete control over the media or whatever, then this tension that the Justice and Development Party is very close to a plurality, but not quite, and the opposition combined can be just enough to force a coalition government, but they'll never have enough. Right now, that they're not ever likely to have the individual power to rival the none of the other current opposition parties have enough in them really to take a rival stance by themselves against the Justice and Development Party. Like something would seriously have to change, and the opposition parties resort to simply like waiting till campaigns to give good policy